So just a couple of weeks back, there was new reporting in ProPublica highlighting the extensive civilian casualties from night raids in Afghanistan carried out by the CIA, Special Forces, and their Afghan army proxy. So this is an extensive article. It's a decently long read, probably take you 30 minutes or so to read it. On a December night in 2018, Mazala was jolted awake by a shuddering wave of noise that rattled her family's small mud house. A trio of helicopters, so unfamiliar that she had no word for them, rapidly descended, kicking up clouds of dust that shimmered in the blinding lights. Men wearing desert camouflage and black masks flooded into the house, corralling her two sons and forcing them out of the door. Mazala watched as the gunman questioned Safiola, 28, and 20-year-old Sabir, before roughly pinning them against a courtyard wall. Then, ignoring their frantic protests of innocence, the masked men put guns to the back of her sons' heads. One shot, two, then a third. Her youngest, the quiet, gentle one, was still alive after the first bullet, Mazala told me, so they shot him again. Mazala's neighbors had pressed me to meet her. I was a foreigner. I must be able to help. 3 months had passed since the raid. The neighbors believed it was the work of the feared Zero units, squadrons of U.S.-trained Afghan Special Forces soldiers. 2 more homes in the area were targeted that night, they said, though no one else was killed. Everyone acknowledged the Taliban had been in that area before. They were everywhere in Nangarhar province. But Mazala's sons? They were just farmers, the neighbors told me. That trip was the first time I'd heard of these secretive units, which I'd soon learn were funded, trained, and armed by the CIA to go after targets believed to be a threat to the United States. There was something else. The Afghan soldiers weren't alone in the raids. U.S. Special Operations Forces soldiers working with the CIA often joined them. It was a classified war, I'd later discovered, with the lines of accountability so obscured that no one had to answer publicly for operations that went wrong. So here we are talking about another one of the dark sides of U.S. foreign policy, the untold massacre of civilians, as we hear of this poor woman's story of waking up in the middle of the night to have helicopters land around your house, drag your sons out of your house, and shoot them in their heads. Let's read on here. As one U.S. Army ranger ruefully told me after the Taliban's triumph last year, you go on night raids, make more enemies, then you gotta go on more night raids for the more enemies you now have to kill. It's almost as if the whole operation was, absolutely fucked. It's almost as if these actions were counterproductive. There's one thing about this article that's absolutely obnoxious, by the way, and it's common amongst this educated class of mainstream journalists who love to make themselves seem so smart and creative unnecessarily all the fucking time. This woman loves to write and color and inject herself into the story so much, and I mean it makes sense. She goes on the story to tell how she was orphaned as a child in a night raid and in Afghanistan, not by Americans. I don't want to spend an extra 20 minutes reading about you. The story is about night raids in Afghanistan and the CIA's responsibility for that. I don't want to spend, a third of the article reading descriptive words or reading about your life or your feelings or what you thought. Can you please just report on what's actually important? Besides that, the article is great. I cataloged hundreds of night raids by one of the 4 Zero unit squads, which was known in Afghanistan as O2 unit, eventually identifying at least 452 civilians killed in its raids over 4 years. I crisscrossed hundreds of miles of Afghanistan, interviewing survivors, eyewitnesses, doctors, and elders in villages seldom, if ever, visited by reporters. The circumstances of the civilian deaths were rarely clear, but the grieving families I spoke to in these remote communities were united in their rage at the Americans and at the US-backed Kabul government. So in just her limited work with her limited resources, studying one of these 4 death squad units over just a period of 4 years, she managed to uncover 452 civilians that were murdered. Unreal. Think about what the real numbers is. It's obviously in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. Because how many units like this are operating in a theater of war? And then consider how many theaters of war we have around the globe. We have AFRICOM, we have what's going on in Asia, we have going on in South America, we have Ukraine, we have so much going on. So here we get into some meat of the story. Let me just read. U.S. military intelligence agencies have long used night raids by forces like the O2 to fight insurgencies, and since the Vietnam War have defended the tactic, arguing that the raids are less likely to cause civilian casualties than aerial bombing. But even a cursory review of U.S. military history raises serious questions about the operations, especially in places like Afghanistan, which is defended by deep tribal loyalties and where the high civilian death toll has time and time again turned people against the United States and the local government it supported. In 1967, the CIA's Phoenix program famously used kill-capture raids against the Viet Cong insurgency in South Vietnam, creating an intense public blowback. William Colby, the then CIA executive director and former chief of the Saigon station, conceded to Congress in 1971 that it wasn't possible to differentiate with certainty between enemy insurgents or people who were neutral or even allies. Despite the program's ignominious reputation, a 1971 Pentagon study found only 3% of those killed or captured were fully or probationary Viet Cong members above the district level. It appears to have served as a blueprint for future night raid operations. The U.S. used night raids in Al-Qaeda in Iraq under David Petraeus and General McChrystal. Military officials said many of the operations killed or captured their targets, but it's impossible to determine how often the intelligence was wrong or misguided, and civilians paid the price. As in Afghanistan, complete casualty data has remained either classified, unavailable, or untracked. Back in the 70s, back in Vietnam in the 60s, when they actually did a little bit of the paperwork, when they were doing these kill-captured raids, they figured out that in the end, they were getting 1 to 2 or 3% of these people were actually Viet Cong members. So that means 97% of the time they were murdering, harassing, assaulting, terrorizing regular, ordinary people. And what do you think happens to regular, ordinary people when they are terrorized by an outside force over and over again? Some certain population of those terrorized people pick up arms and start to fight back. And now we have more terrorists, insurgents, whatever you want to call them. So not only do we have a CIA that doesn't understand its enemy or perceived enemies in Afghanistan, for example, but we have a CIA that is rogue and unaccountable and, for lack of a better word, stupid. In the name of U.S. interests, which is corporate interest and weapons manufacturers' interest, they're willing to unleash death squads that kill 90% civilians, in order to, quote, see results. And what are the end results of that? We abandon the country in legendary fashion in the Kabul airport, echoing, ironically, Vietnam and Saigon. It's almost as if we never learn. It's almost as if we never learn. Let me read a little more here. 2 lawyers working for years with whistleblowers on Afghanistan war crimes told me they'd experienced similar roadblocks. There's not any real desire from the Pentagon or the executive branch to track civilian casualties accurately, said Jesselyn Raddick, a national security and human rights attorney who represented Daniel Hale, a former U.S. Air Force intelligence analyst, among others. Hale was convicted for disclosing classified information that nearly 90% of the people killed by U.S. airstrikes in Afghanistan were not the intended targets. Raddick said Afghans who were killed because of faulty intelligence or botched raids were often classified as if they were caught in legitimate crossfire or were part of a terrorist group. So even with the statistics that says 90% of the time we fucked up, we're still fucking the numbers, right? When civilians die, we're either not counting it, or if we do count it, we're acting as if, oh, there was a legitimate battle with, a third party who were the bad guys and they were caught in the middle. But in reality, they murdered those people. There was no third party. They murdered those people and, oh, they fucked up. It wasn't actually terrorists. Or they just lie and say they were a terrorist and throw a gun on their body, and that's that. It's absolutely insane. But here's another thing. Get ready for this. Radek said she'd seen official accounts from operations in Afghanistan in which children killed by mistake were called tits, or terrorists in training. Or, she said, a child had the wrong father, so he was adjacent to terrorist activities. The ages of children had been changed to make them appear older than they were. The pressure to make civilian casualties not civilian casualties is pretty intense. When we do murder kids, we're calling them tits. We're calling them terrorists in training. We're calling tits. That's the acronym they came up with. We're lying about their age. We're bumping their age up, pretending they're older. We're murdering them. They were terrorists in training. They were a suicide bomber. They're this, they're that. The CIA is rogue and unaccountable, and this is what they're doing in your name with your money. They're training a bunch of people to be psychos and go on night raids in their own country, kick down doors of their neighbors, and shoot people in the head without investigations, due process, evidence, things that we in the West pretend to uphold. And what's the end result of that? The end result of that is the Taliban wins, Afghanistan collapses, and now we have thousands upon thousands of these death squad soldiers that we trained. We brought them here to the United States. The ones that we did save. We left most of them there to rot and be murdered by the Taliban, by the way. So even if you sell your soul to us and murder people for our interests, we will still leave you there to die. Well, maybe we'll save a couple of you and your families, but most of you will be left behind to die. So our drone program kills mostly civilians. Our night raids are killing civilians left and right. The CIA is responsible, but will they be held to account? Absolutely not.
What's the matter? The CIA got you pushing too many pencils? Huh?